Good morning, good day, good afternoon, good evening, good night, wherever you are. And welcome back to Achampnator Reads. This time again with The Last Elf, chapter 30. Yosh hadn't the faintest idea what to do or how to do it. Turning himself into the soldiers at the great gate was the only idea that had come to him, and he wasn't entirely convinced that it was a brilliant one. He had done a swap, turning himself in without a fight in exchange for the girl, not just because he owed it to Monzer and Saya, but because he had seen her, and she was now the only thing that meant anything to him. He didn't know how to fight, so what else could he do? Often in the complicated fairy stories that he had read to Erbrow the elder during the brood, something was exchanged for something else. I give you half a pound of kurgets and quarter of a pint of beans. And when she's born, your daughter will be mine. Or, if you bring me 3 tail feathers of the golden vulture, you will have half of my kingdom, or alternatively 7/8 of the magic carpet and 5/11 of the pot of abundance. And everyone kept to their agreement. So he was unaware that pacts are sometimes not respected, and that you have to make your contract from a position of strength before giving up that position. He should have freed Robbie first and then turned himself in. The fact was, he now realized that it had seemed rude to him to suggest that they might not be men of honor, and to take precautions accordingly, and turning up all by himself at the garrison by the gate, where they were all armed to the teeth and with arrows aimed, hadn't been particularly clever. He shouldn't have threatened reprisals by the dragon. Too late now. He had been arrested, and now the plan was hanging for everyone. Yosh in the square and Robbie in the depths of the dungeon. Yosh was wrapped in so many chains that he had trouble breathing. He was surrounded by so many soldiers that he couldn't count them. His only consolation was that they were taking him to the dungeons of the palace of Deligar, and he knew that Robbie was there. He'd think of something. He had to. If there was an ancient prophecy about his future, it meant that he still had a possible future ahead of him, and he wouldn't escape without taking Robbie with him. He was taken downstairs that became more and more narrow and steep, passing along corridors that became lower and darker, deeper and deeper into the earth, farther from the daylight, until finally the walls widened, and in the torchlight he saw a figure dressed opulently in white, smelling strangely of rancid beer, whom he recognized as the judge administrator. Behind him, the darkness beyond the bars concealed the barely perceptible little figure of Robbie. The judge wasted no time. "I've been waiting for you, elf," he said. "You've come in search of your future wife, haven't you?" "I know it." Yosh was speechless. How did he know? Certainly, Robbie was little more than a child, and he was still a boy. But elves choose their wives very young and forever. Each time he thought of Robbie, her face, her tenderness, and the courage with which she had tried to protect and comfort the younger girl, the one with the missing thumb. No, she was the one. "I know it," the judge continued. "I too know how to read the ancient tongues. I too read the prophecy before having it destroyed, along with all the other writings that sullied the walls of this place. Reading does the people no good. Not that anyone here can do it. I have taken precautions to avoid that misfortune. The prophecy was written by Arduin, the great wizard, the Lord of Light, the founder. By the Dalaga was once an elfish city. You knew that, did you not? After the ogres destroyed it, Arduin reconquered and re-established it. He was completely mad. Arduin, he loved elves, and he was not without a certain degree of military acumen. Certainly, freeing the city from the ogres when they were at the peak of their power, attacking with an army that was not even half the size of his adversaries, and defeating them nonetheless, was an undertaking that required a certain level of skill, a certain level of wisdom, too, I grant you, but nothing comparable to mine. I'm the true founder of Dalaga, its true liberator. I'm liberating Dalaga from passion, from selfishness. I'm leading it back to virtue and humility. With my justice and my severity, I'm purging it, and I'm making it more beautiful. I too am a magician, much greater than Arduin, who could only predict the future and destroy the spell of the shadow, with which the ogres had enslaved the world. I have done more than that. Haven't you noticed? Haven't you seen my extraordinary marvel, my triumph? Silence. A long silence. Yorsh wondered if he was expected to say anything. He probably was, but honestly, he had no idea of what their judge administrator's extraordinary marvel might be. The only thing that came to mind was that Dalagar had struck him as an extraordinarily miserable place, and it was somehow marvelous that it could be so after such a splendid past. The embarrassed silence continued, and finally the judge went on. The flowers, he exploded in exasperation. The wisteria that are always in flower, the perfume of the jasmines, by rotting down enormous quantities of fruit and grain that we are sent from the countryside. We obtain a special fertilizer which gives us permanent flowers and perfumes of great intensity. Isn't it extraordinary? It's really extraordinary. Is it not? Yosh stared at the judge in fascination. He was mad, completely and spectacularly insane. There could not be the slightest doubt about this madness. What he failed to understand was the reason why the many armed onlookers remained at attention in the face of this madness. Rather than taking him by the hand and leading him politely but firmly to a place where his delirium might be cured, or at least rendered harmless. I also had to destroy Arduin's old royal palace. Arches all over the place, those dull old arches and columns, alternating with those dull flowers, beds, surrounded by those ludicrous cedar trees. I, the judge, knocked almost all of it down, leaving only the porticos because a new era had dawned. An era unlike anything ever seen before, an era of which my palace was the very symbol. Arduin, the judge went on, before he died, wrote his prophecy. The last elf will marry a girl. His descendant, the heir of Arduin himself. The girl will be endowed, like her forefather, with the power of clairvoyance, and will have in her name the light of the morning. She will be the daughter of the man and the woman who, and her a word was and here word was missing, weathered away by time. Who? Somethinged. The elf. I guess. I guess the word was probably hated. When they told me you had entered my garden and had seen my delightful daughter, Dawn, I understood that you would come back and take her, and that I would then be able and obliged to destroy you. Dawn? The judge's daughter? The awful girl he'd seen on the swing? The judge's daughter was called Dawn? The light of sunrise? The jewel of malevolence, arrogance, and bossiness had the light of morning in her name? My daughter Dawn, in her name the light of morning. I brought her up to absolute perfection. She's the perfect girl. She plays the lute, reads ancient poems, and sings as she sits on her swing, like the princesses of kingdoms past. At least as they are represented in images on parchment. So, since she reached the age of reason, she has been allowed to do nothing. Dawn has, except play the lute and swing and sing among the flowers, because for a girl, that is perfection. I have to drink something, guys and girls. Sorry for the short break, but before I have to yawn constantly, I drink something. And if you like the story, please leave a like down below. Lute playing and singing on a swing, from morning till night, day after day. Josh began to feel a spark of sympathy for poor Dawn, forced as she was to live like the perfect imitation of that absurd story about some princess who might never even have existed. That was why she was such an unbearably silly goose. Perfection must be an unbearable burden. Dawn is my daughter, and Booth the heir to Arduin, because since I am like him, the head of the city, I am his successor. The judge's voice had risen, and now he was uttering his words more precisely, as though to lend them greater weight. And Dawn has the ability to predict the future. Did you know that? Once she predicted that she would have the gold necklace that belonged to the wife of the head of the guards. And guess what? He turned out to be a traitor. He was hanged, his goods were confiscated, and the gold necklace is Dawn's. And when she predicted that sooner or later the dryness of last summer would come to an end, and that it would rain in autumn, she was right again. For a few moments a vague smile disfigured the judge's features. Josh's brain was in torment. Dawn, the awful, nasty, stupid girl on the swing, the girl who could make little children cry for hours on end. He felt sorry for her. In her own way, she too had a difficult, in fact, unbearable fate. But there was really no question of founding a new tribe with her. Never. He'd rather have the gallows. Never. Not for anything in the world. His destiny stopped there, along with his patience, with Arduin and his prophecies. Perhaps poor Arduin, the Lord of Light, had been feeling the effects of age. The light must have blinded him from time to time, and the shadows had blurred in his head, waging where war against the ogres couldn't have been a picnic. During some siege or other, Arduin must have bumped his head against something very hard and got it into his mind that the last elf could, under any circumstances, marry Dawn. Now the problem was how to get Robbie back and quickly cause a disturbance, leaving the judge and his delightful daughter with their brilliant predictions. The judge was holding his bow with the 3 arrows and his little blue velvet bag. "Let's see what you brought, elf, to destroy us. Your bow and your arrows are in my hands. What else have we here?" The judge squeezed the velvet bag. The golden beans fell to the floor. The scent was too subtle for humans, but not for an elf. As the beans scattered, Josh smelled their perfume, faint, but unmistakably sweet and penetrating, like freshly baked bread. Josh remembered the rats, the big fat rats of the prisons of Delagar, but had helped him once before, when he was a child. They too were able to smell the scent of the beans, and their minds would fill with it. Rats' minds are easy to control. There were thousands of them. Josh felt them. He felt their eternal, insatiable hunger, the fury, the grudges they bore over all the kicks, the stones, the darts thrown for fun, the poisoned bait. Thousands of them in all the cells. Hungry, angry, mean. Josh breathed and felt the air filling his lungs, felt his strength increasing. He knew what to do. He would use the rats. He intensified the perfume of the golden beans, and with it he sought the minds of the rats and guided them. A child's toy. The judge dropped the spinning top to the floor and smashed it with a kick. And a book. Interesting, is it not? The rats were starting to emerge from the darkness, behind the bars from the darkness, behind the corridors off to the side. Some of them ran along the walls using the frieze ornaments between the torches. There were not yet many, a few dozen. Josh took the fear from their minds. Others arrived, and behind them yet more, and then more. They made straight for the beans, heedless of the soldiers, and utterly fearless. A wave of flesh, hair, and tiny teeth that submerged the man's feet like an incoming tide. The soldiers tried to dodge, to escape, crashing into one another as they did so. The judge was holding the poetry book that had belonged to Josh's mother, and was concentrating on it too, hard to notice anything. What are they spells? Poetry? What nonsense. Follow the blue ivy branch. Follow the blue ivy branch. I know your language, elf. Are you aware of that? You should always know the language of your enemies. Follow the blue ivy branch. Ivy's green, I know that. Elves always lie. Is it not so? Even in the poetry. Follow the blue ivy branch. It will lead you to where the gold gleams. Find where the water gurgles. The future depends on our strength. And the rats had begun to bite not only the golden beans, but everything they could find. That is, the feet and legs of the soldiers and the judge, who dropped the book with a shriek. Only Josh and Robbie were unharmed. The feet, free of the uniform layer of rats that had covered everything like a swarming treacherous shifting carpet, and with teeth. Some of the men started to run away, pressing themselves against the walls so as not to lose their balance. Josh concentrated on the locks. Clank! The lock holding Josh's wrists opened and his chains fell at his feet. Clank! His ankles were free too. The tide of rats swept over everything. The judge tripped over the remains of the spinning top and fell to the ground. The few remaining soldiers hurried to try and protect him and lift him up, leaving Robbie's bars completely unguarded. Clank! That lock was open as well. Josh took her by the hand and pulled her out. Then they left slowly, walking backward as not to lose sight of the soldiers and the judge, while the sea of rats parted obediently as they passed. Josh pulled a torch from the wall and glanced one last time at the group. The judge was on his feet again, but he was too busy defending himself to worry about them. The stairs swarmed with soldiers, and above them were more stairs with more soldiers, and yet more soldiers, and yet more. In the minds of the rats, however, there was an image of a vast labyrinthine, subterranean world that stretched beneath the city and beneath the river. Josh saw what the rats saw, and he and Robbie turned and started to run in the opposite direction of the stairs. Bars blocked their way, but fortunately they were closed with a lock that opened easily, and the corridor continued on the other side. Josh slammed all the locks shut behind him to hold up their potential pursuers. He ardently hoped for a glimmer, a blade of sunlight, to show them some way of escaping to ground level, but nothing of the kind appeared. The corridor ran downhill, always downhill, through tunnels that grew darker and darker. The rats became fewer on the ground. More gates, more locks, more corridors, farther and farther down, deeper and darker. Whoever had built the old royal palace, probably Arduin, had decided to exploit the ancient elfish underground passages by transforming one part into a prison, separated from the rest by ancient and impassable gates. His old royal palace had then collapsed, and on top of it had risen the curious palace of justice, with its incomprehensible shape, but the prisons had been preserved intact. Josh and Robbie stopped breathless. Josh was frightened. He wasn't sure he would be able to get them out of there. Sooner or later the rats would be distracted, or else someone would remember that it took only a torch to scatter them, and they would find themselves discussing their chances of survival with the army of Delagar, and the discussion would not be a friendly one, or they would simply be lost in the middle of half-dilapidated tunnels, waiting for hunger to do the gallows job. "I don't know where to go," he admitted as soon as he was able to speak. Robbie smiled at him and gestured with her hand toward the ceiling of the tunnel, where the flickering torchlight illuminated a long fresco showing a shoot of blue ivy. His mother's poetry book was another map. They had only to follow the path. The fact was that the ivy was everywhere, where the tunnels forked, where they went off in 3-4 different directions in the tunnels that led nowhere, growing more and more cramped, so that they had to crawl back, and the ones that came to a dead end, with walls richly painted with images of fountains and gardens. Looking carefully, Josh noticed that at some points the chutes assumed the shapes of elfish letters, when the word formed was "Go." The path was not interrupted. They were in an ancient maze. There were lots of crossroads with different tunnels bearing the same kind of fresco, and they had to reconstruct the trail with the letters hidden in the pattern of the ivy shoots. Sometimes there was the word "No." Sometimes a mocking verse. If these painted words you see, longer still your path will be. Or, if attention close you pay, you will never lose your way. To anyone unfamiliar with the Elvish language, the maze was inextricable but someone armed with patience, time, and a length of string that could be unrolled to find their way back would be able to explore and defeat it. They needed to get a move on. It would it would take them some time, but sooner or later the judge's soldiers would arrive. The game became more complicated. The word go began to lead to blind alleys or stairs leading nowhere. One of the walls showed the game of elvish chess, with nymphs and two black dragons fighting around a queen wearing a crown twined with blue and ivy. The key was the book. Poems alternated with riddles. For we are, in our hearts, a warrior's bravery, sword in hand. Proud-eyed, we protect the queen. The nymphs Yorsh looked very carefully at the spot where the nymphs' hand grasped their swords. I have to look how many sides, yes. There were four slender, almost unnoticeable cracks concealed by the painted shadows of the hills. Slipping in his hand, Yorsh found some levers which his fingers managed to touch, but not to move. It didn't matter. The important thing was that he knew where the movement was supposed to occur. So that he could guide it as he had done with the locks. Clank! The wall was a panel, and it slid away, but the levers, worn by time and moisture, broke as they opened, and the panel couldn't be slipped back into place behind them. They were opening up a path for the pursuers, guiding them into the ancient underground passageways. Another wall led abruptly to a dizzying spiral staircase that brought them so far down into the earth that Yorsh started to think they were somewhere beneath the river. The sea was painted on the wall. When we get out of here, we'll go and live by the sea, Yorsh said to Robbie. Perhaps more of his own reassurance than hers. Little fruits, sun-reddened, splashed by salty spray, the book read. Looking closely at the painting, Yorsh located a little island with a wild cherry tree growing on it. The one he had flown over on Urbrow's back. Had it existed centuries ago, with a cherry tree growing on it, the great-grandfather of the present one, or had the painter simply imagined it, dreamed it up? In the tree, the cherries gleamed with a shiny red that darkened toward the shadows. There once again he found the cracks that concealed the mechanisms. Clank! Once again the panel opened up, and once again they couldn't slide it back and behind them. The only important thing at this point was to move on. They were going farther and farther down, under the bowels of the city, into what had been the underground passages of the royal palace of the elf capital. Enormous cobwebs veiled their path. Little stone falls that made it narrow alternated with flutes of water that widened it. More and more often they found themselves crawling in the mud, as the air thinned and filled with dust and old smells of earth, water, and rotten leaves. Yorsh was terrified. It was quite possible that he was heading for death, and infinitely worse, that he was taking Robbie with him. Until that moment, he hadn't really been afraid of anything because, in a sense, the prophecy protected him. The fact that someone, in this case Arduin, Lord of Light, had mentioned his fate suggested that at least he had won, but now he knew that he had escaped the prophecy. Spent his life with that horrible girl Dawn? He'd sooner be eaten by a troll or die in the underground passages of Delagar. If the prophecy was only partly true, even his right to survival became a matter of opinion. Arduin was in favor, the judge administrator absolutely opposed, and the latter was much closer than the former, and had more people at his disposal. If only he could save Robbie. The tunnel stopped abruptly. They were advancing on all fours through the mud when they came face to face with a set of bars. On the other side, the darkness widened and the air was cold and clean. The tunnel ended in a cave. The bars consisted of complicated that imitated ivy. The leaves were of silver, the shoots of gold, and they twined into coiled arches. They were clearly a piece of elfish workmanship, and were not made to be opened. There were neither locks nor hinges. They were bars, plain and simple, not a gate. "I've got a question for you," said Robbie. In the flickering torchlight, her dark eyes shone like stars, and a smile lit up her face. Josh gave a faint smile of encouragement, hoping that it wasn't a request for information about the survival, because that wasn't something he wished to talk about at any length. "Now?" he asked. Robbie nodded. Shyness filled her face, erasing her smile, but stubbornly she nodded. "All right then. What do you want to do now?" "What the judge said. Descendant," he said. "Does that mean doing the same job or having the same blood?" "Meaning the daughter of the son of the grandson of the daughter. Something like that. Do you see?" Josh was puzzled and moved. The girl's thirst of knowledge was so intense that even now, with the prospect of choosing between a new meeting with the judge and the gallows or a more peaceful death from starvation, she had lost herself in questions of semantics. "It could mean either," he explained. Robbie nodded. "Did he have lots of children, that lord? The one with the light?" "You mean Arduin?" "Yes." Josh tried to remember. Yes, I remember now. He had a son who succeeded him and then died childless. Gesane the Wise, and at least 6 daughters, 2 of whom went to live away from Delega when they got married. And those daughters had sons or daughters, who had more sons or daughters, who had more sons or daughters, so that now there's no way of knowing who's descendant of Arduin. He might have descendants who don't even know they are," she concluded triumphantly. Josh thought about that for a moment. As conservations went, it was actually a bit ridiculous, but at least it deferred the moment when they would have to admit that all hope was lost. "Yes, I think that's right," he agreed. "And Claire was something? Clairvoyance?" "That's it, clairvoyance. It means when you close your eyes and images of things that are going to happen form all by themselves." "Yes," Josh replied firmly. He had had enough of the conversation. "There's no way of getting around these bars." "But of course there is," Robbie replied calmly. "There must be. There can't not be. It's just that you haven't thought hard enough about it yet. Haven't you even got anything to eat? Even stupid stuff if you like." Stupid stuff? The conversation was becoming more and more absurd. "Of course!" Josh had stitched 2 secret inner pockets into his tunic, thanks to the instructions from 26 books on sewing and embroidery in his library, and now he looked inside them. There was still a handful of golden beans. He gave them to Robbie, and their hands brushed in passing. Josh felt a strange sensation in his stomach, something halfway between hunger and a hiccup, and it was the first time he had felt it. Robbie filled her mouth with beans. Josh knew how good they were. He smiled at the ecstatic expression on her face. the happiness with which she ate. He felt her joy within him. It was like a hurricane. Of course, he would get her out of there. He was outside the prophecy, but he was also still an elf, the last one, and the most powerful. He was in an ancient elfish royal palace. The path was there. They had only to find it. And to find it, they just had to be as certain that they could. He was tempted to tell Robbie how much he loved her, that she was the only thing in the world that existed for him. But fortunately, he stopped. Robbie was not an elf, but a human being. And human beings choose their companions not when they are children, but when they are adults. He would have to wait and hope that Robbie would eventually accept him. That might be more likely if he put it off for a few years. And besides, he was an elf. The major, the majority of humans hated elves. Even Mons and Sire hated him. At first. He would have to wait for Robbie to know him better, if he wanted to have a chance. Then Robbie asked him about Dawn. Did he know her? Had he seen how beautiful she was? George was about to tell her how hateful he thought she was, when another thought came to him. Robbie was so incredibly unafraid because she was sure of the prophecy, and that their survival was therefore guaranteed. If he told her the truth, fear would grip her in its claws like a sparrow hawk. He confined himself to a vague nod of agreement. That was chapter 30 of The Last Elf. The next time I read for you chapter 31. But till now, see ya.